Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you've all had a great week. If you are new here, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. So I recently put up a poll on my community page, and it was just me basically trying to understand which type of content that I create that you guys prefer to hear. And the options were cults, true crime, and historical crimes. And you guys overwhelmingly chose cults. So you'll be happy to know that today's case is another cult case. Today we are talking about The Work, which is probably the lamest name for a cult that I've ever heard. But the Work cult was started in 1970 by a man named Julius Schacknow, who went by the name of Brother Julius. And Brother Julius was absolutely disgusting, and he was a very dangerous person. He took advantage of hundreds of people over the course of several years. And over the years, Brother Julius went through an evolution of sorts. First, claiming that he was a prophet, then claiming to be the, quote, sinful Messiah. He claimed that he was Jesus Christ, which is where the name Julius Christ came from. It was just a play on words that his followers came up with. And then apparently his final form was God. He claimed that he was in fact God.
I feel now it's time for everybody to know who I am and why I'm on earth.
This man was extremely controlling and manipulative, and he used his power over his followers in the worst possible way. And you'll have to let me know if you've heard of this cult before. I hadn't, and it seems really undercovered, which is surprising to me because this cult was pretty awful. There's at least one murder associated with this cult that we are 100% sure of, but there are potentially several more, and this cult still exists to this day. And also, this was all happening in the quiet suburbs of Connecticut, which makes this all even crazier. So when I was researching this case, I was like, how in the hell have I never heard of this cult before? There is a lot to unpack here, so let's just go ahead and jump right in. But first, I would like to thank today's sponsor, MyHeritage. I'm sure that you all are familiar with MyHeritage, but if you are not, it is a DNA testing service that allows users to discover so much about their family history. A few weeks ago, I received a DNA kit for MyHeritage, and it was really easy to use. The instructions were very clear and easy to follow. It just takes a couple of minutes to swab the inside of your cheek, and then you place the swab into the vial, get it sealed up into the envelope, and then after you send everything off, you just sit back and wait for your results to come in. And MyHeritage will send you notifications throughout the testing, like just letting you know where they are in the process. And then they'll email you when your results are ready. And I'm super excited because I just received the email that my results are in. So let's go ahead and see what we have. Summer, ready to explore your ethnicity? Okay, let's go. Okay, Summer, you are... Wow, 47% Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. Okay. 22.4% English, okay. Balkan. 12.5% Balkan. Okay, I'm gonna have to do some research into that one. I'm not really sure where that is. 9.6% Italian. Okay, I had no clue that my family had any Italian background. And Iberian, 9% Iberian. That looks like Spain. Wow, okay, so I had no idea about the Iberian, Italian, or the Balkan background. I'm actually not really sure where the Balkan region is. I need to do some research into that one. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, okay. Albania looks like it's in here. So I was always told that my family had a really strong German background, but that's nowhere in here. Oh, this is really cool. So as it's going through each region, it's playing music from that specific region. You can even see all of the people that you've matched with, like all of your distant relatives, close relatives. And it looks like I have almost 15,000 relatives in this database. I had a lot of fun doing this. The testing was simple. The website was really easy to use. And I just absolutely love stuff like this. I find it fascinating. So while you guys enjoy the rest of the video, I will be off digging deeper into these results. And if you are interested in discovering more about your own family history, you can click the link in my description box to get free shipping on your very own DNA kit from MyHeritage when you use my code SUMMER. And as an added bonus, you can start a 30-day free trial of the best subscription on family history research from MyHeritage, and you will even get a 50% discount if you decide to continue using it. And on top of all of that, MyHeritage is also giving away a free DNA kit to one of you. All you need to do is comment below telling me why you want a DNA kit. MyHeritage will select the winner in the coming weeks, so make sure to include some of your social media contact info so that we can reach out to you if you win. Thank you so much to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video and for giving me a stronger understanding of who I am. And now let's jump back into the case. On August 27, 2004, the New Britain police drove out to the Shuttle Meadow Country Club in Kensington, Connecticut, after receiving a call that human remains had been found there on the golf course. When police arrived, they found a severed human leg, and it looked as though the leg had been buried and then dug up, probably by a coyote, and then dragged onto the golf course. Now, of course, once they found this human leg, the police knew that they were dealing with a homicide, but it would be years before they learned the identity of the victim. And once they were finally able to identify the victim, they realized that this was not going to be a straightforward case. Their victim had strong ties to a local cult known as The Work, started by a man named Julius Schacknow. Julius Schacknow was born on August 21st, 1924 in Brooklyn, New York, and he was the youngest of 3 boys. His parents were Bertha and Solomon Schacknow, and we don't really know very much about Julius's childhood. All we really know is that his family was Jewish and they were basically living in poverty. Both of Julius's parents died before he turned 18, so he was still pretty young when he had to venture out on his own. By the 1940s, the 3 Schacknow brothers ended up enlisting in the military during World War II, and they all served as radio men in the Navy. Now, Julius did not have a good time in the Navy. He just wasn't committed. He was basically just there out of necessity. And so he just never took the Navy seriously. In fact, he later said that he went AWOL on more than one occasion. Around this time, he met his first wife. She was a nurse and her name was Elsie Beeville, and they got married sometime in 1945. Now, Elsie was a pretty religious person and she belonged to a Methodist church. So when Julius married Elsie, he converted to Christianity. They had 2 kids together, a daughter whose name I don't know, and a son named Mark. So like I said, Julius did not like being in the Navy, but something significant did happen to him while he was serving. Julius claimed that it was during this time he received his first religious vision. Now, this vision happened not long after Julius suffered a serious head injury during an attack on his assigned ship in the Atlantic Ocean. And I don't know the specifics about that head injury. All I know is that after it happened, he was sent to Guam to a naval hospital there, and it wasn't long after that he claimed that he had this religious vision. So during this vision, which Julius would later go on to refer to as a living vision, he said that he was taken up to heaven where he had a conversation with God. During this conversation, God supposedly said, quote, "Julius, my son, I have chosen you at an important time in your life, and you will help me close the world in your generation." He also said that God called him a predestined vessel, and he was to rid the world of evil and be a light to the Gentiles and a savior to the people of Israel. And he also said that Julius needed to go and study the Bible for 5 years in order to be a better vessel. Now, Julius's account of the living vision would change over the years. Later in life, he claimed that he had fallen into a life of sin and that God had instructed him to not wear a hat. According to Julius, God told him to literally take his hat off and never wear it again. So he said on November 2nd, 1946, he removed his hat, his military issued uniform hat, and he never wore it again. Now, this would become an issue for Julius since he was a member of the Navy and the standard uniform included a hat. He was getting in trouble left and right for being out of uniform. And the military officers started to notice that Julius was acting weird. He just seemed off. So one day they go pick him up and they take him in to be evaluated. And during this evaluation, Julius told them all about the living vision, how he had been taken up to heaven and talked to God. He went through the entire story. And the military officers were very alarmed by what they were hearing. They fully believed that Julius was in the middle of a full-blown mental breakdown, which, looking back on it, could very well have been caused by that head injury that he had sustained. So they put him in a straitjacket and they admitted him to the Naval Psychiatric Hospital. And by the summer of 1947, Julius had been honorably discharged. So now Julius is back in the States with his wife Elsie and his 2 kids. And at some point, the Schacknow family got involved in a church known as the Gospel Assembly Church. So I fell down a rabbit hole when I was researching this church, and it very much sounds like a cult. In fact, there is a lot of information about this church on the Cult Education Institute website, which I will link in the description. So the Gospel Assembly Church is a non-denominational church, and they have been involved in a lot of controversy. Former members have spoken out claiming that there's widespread abuse, including psychological abuse and mind control, and unfortunately, but absolutely not surprisingly, sexual abuse. The members are expected to dress and behave in a certain way. The women can't wear makeup. They can't have their hair down. They have to wear long sleeves, basically just not show any skin. The church elders even arrange marriages and will actively try, and most of the time succeed, in breaking up relationships between members that they don't want to be together. Members are also encouraged to not attend college, and this is just a way for the church to keep out any outside, rational influence that a college campus might be on the members. Just a way to keep their perspective as narrow as humanly possible. And if any of the members get out of line or seem like they're questioning the authority or the teachings of the elders, they will be publicly humiliated in front of the entire congregation, berated, called names, and just verbally and mentally abused in a very public setting. And if a member does get up the courage to leave, they'll be ostracized from the other members. And family members of the person who leaves will be encouraged to cut ties with them. And all of this has caused a lot of people to fall into deep depressions, and some former members have said that they have even contemplated taking their own lives. And you will definitely see later in the case that Julius took a lot of inspiration from the Gospel Assembly Church. And of course, this is not unique to Gospel Assembly. Unfortunately, this type of abuse and brainwashing is absolutely rampant throughout many churches and many different denominations. Gospel Assembly churches were, and as far as I can tell still are, in several different locations throughout the United States. I believe there are even some of these churches in Canada. And this is just a side note, but the daughter that Julius and Elsie had is believed to not actually be Julius's biological daughter. According to Mark Schacknow, Julius's son, it's widely believed that his sister's real father was one of the leaders of the Gospel Assembly Church, a man named Thomas Jolly. Mark later asked his mother Elsie about this, but she was very dodgy when he'd bring it up, and she would just never give him a straight answer. So when Julius was discharged from the military, he decided that it was time for him to follow the instructions that he'd been given during the vision and set out on his 5-year journey to study the Bible. He started attending the Bible Institute of Los Angeles in 1947, and this institute was led by Protestant fundamentalists. During his time at the Bible Institute, he was given the name Brother Julius, and he would go on to use this name throughout the rest of his life. And while there, he took on a lot of fundamentalist views. And Julius became so obsessed with the teachings of the Institute and so obsessed with reading and interpreting his Bible day in and day out that he just started to put everything else on the back burner, and that included his family. They were just not his priority. Elsie would later say that around this time, when Julius was home, he was just down in the basement, just reading his Bible alone. She would go down there at night to turn off the lights, and she would find him asleep with his Bible laid across his chest. Fulfilling his mission from God was now all he cared about. Elsie also said that she knew that Julius had some sort of mental illness, but he would refuse to get help for his condition, and over the years, it just continued to get worse and worse. And this all eventually caused a huge rift in his marriage. And in 1950, Elsie filed for divorce from Julius, and she got full custody of the kids. Elsie and her children ended up moving around quite a bit, and unfortunately they most of the time lived in poverty, and they would rely on the help of the Gospel Assembly Church in various states. And so her children were deeply affected by being forced to grow up in such an abusive church. Her son Mark actually wrote an article about his years in the Gospel Assembly Church, and that article is on the Cult Education website, and I will link that one as well. In the article, Mark talks about an incident involving his own young young daughter where some of the teenage boys in the church attempted to abuse her. Thankfully, his daughter knew that something wasn't right, so she did manage to escape the situation, and she told her parents. Mark and his wife went to the church elders and they told them what happened, but nothing was done. And they actually had the nerve to tell Mark and his wife to just keep their daughter away from those boys and to be careful with how they dressed her. This little girl was 5 years old when this happened. It's infuriating and pathetic anytime someone implies that a woman is to blame for assault just because of how she acts or dresses, but the audacity to say this about a 5-year-old little girl. And it's just such a sad situation because Elsie needed help to provide for her children, and she felt that she could only be helped by that church, which in the end had such a negative impact on her kids and then later her grandkids. Okay, so now back to Julius. In 1955, Julius married his second wife, a woman named Mary Evelyn Smith, and they went on to have 3 kids, although one of those children did pass away not long after birth. And during this time, Julius became a minister for the Gospel Assembly Church in St. Louis, Missouri. However, Julius and Reverend Thomas Jolly, remember Jolly? He's the one believed to be the real father of Julius's daughter with his first wife. Well, Julius and Reverend Jolly started to have a bit of a power struggle within the church. Like I said, Jolly was one of the highest leaders within the Gospel Assembly Church, and in some sources, he's even referred to as being one of the founders of the church. So when Julius came in with his vast knowledge of scripture and his charismatic way, which we haven't really touched on, but Julius was said to be charismatic and kind of charming and very well spoken, just like textbook cult leader traits. So eventually it seems like Jolly started to feel a little threatened by Julius, and so he started to target him in an attempt to ruin his reputation within the church and just run him out, which actually did end up working in the end. And Julius ended up leaving the Gospel Assembly Church. But like I said, he would go on to take a lot of inspiration from that church. Now, by 1959, his second marriage was ending. Mary wanted out because Julius couldn't stay faithful to her, and she ended up getting custody of their 2 children, and she left. But that was no problem for Julius because by 1962, he was married for a 3rd time, this time to a woman named Joanne St. Beatrix, and the 2 were living in Brooklyn, New York. Joanne had been married before, and she had 4 children of her own, and she and Julius ended up having 3 kids together as well. So during this time, Julius started traveling around to random parts of the United States and just preaching. He would do this pretty much anywhere, public parks, anywhere where people were kind of congregating, and he would also make a lot of failed doomsday predictions. And one of these doomsday predictions he came up with was that a catastrophic earthquake would completely destroy New York in the year 1971. And because of this prediction, Julius, his wife Joanne, and all of their children moved from New York to Dover, New Jersey. And now we're about to get into those suspected murders that I mentioned earlier. So when Julius and his family moved to Dover, New Jersey, he got a job working as an electronic parts buyer for the International Telephone and Telegraph Company. And while he was there, he started a lunch break Bible study group, and he would invite his coworkers to sit and listen to him preach while they were on their lunch break. He would also go around to various churches in the area, and he would preach there as like a guest speaker. And he started to really make a name for himself within the local religious community. He started wearing long white robes. He let his hair grow out, his beard grow out, presumably trying to make himself look more like Jesus, I guess. And this was pretty much all consuming. So by 1968, he quit his job and he made preaching his full-time gig. His teachings have been described as a mix of Christian fundamentalism, Judaism, science fiction, faith healing, and the occult. And he also allegedly took a lot of inspiration from movies and TV series like Star Trek, Helter Skelter, and The Exorcist. And at this point, Julius had acquired a small, loyal following, and he would take his followers down to rivers or lakes or beaches, and he would conduct mass baptisms. But there were also people who would listen to Julius, or Brother Julius as he had everyone call him, and they would think he was insane. And one of these people who completely disagreed with Julius's views was his neighbor, a man named Joseph Jaquish. Joseph, his wife, and his 9 kids lived next door to the Schacknow family. And Julius absolutely hated the Jaquish family. He and Joseph would get into arguments about religion all the time. And over time, Julius started telling people that the Jaquish family was possessed and that their home was infested with demons. And he would also say that Joseph and his entire family would burn in the fires of hell, which you'll see in a minute that comment would make Julius look very suspicious. In the very early morning hours of November 3rd, 1969, there was a fire at the Jaquish family home. The fire originated downstairs in the front part of the home, and the flames completely engulfed the house. Joseph, his wife, and 2 of his 9 kids did manage to escape the fire, but tragically the other 7 children were trapped upstairs when the roof caved in on them. The 2 surviving kids were Judy and Edward Jaquish, and the other children who didn't make it out of the fire were between the ages of 12 and 2 years old. There was an investigation into the fire because it was believed to be arson. This was not an accidental fire. And Julius Schacknow became a prime suspect. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that Julius hated the Jaquish family. He had not been quiet about that. Calling them demons and saying they were possessed and that they would burn in the fires of hell, this was all very suspicious. Not to mention the fact that Julius lived right next door and had every opportunity to start this fire. The heating system was quickly ruled out as being the cause of the fire, and there were also empty gasoline cans found on the front porch. The case did end up going before a grand jury, but in the end, there just wasn't enough evidence to prove that Julius was responsible, and the case was eventually closed. And unfortunately, that's all the information I have about the fire and the death of the Jaquish children. It's widely believed that they were murdered by Julius Schacknow, but we'll probably never know for sure. But this was not the only time that Julius was suspected of murder. Not long after that fire, someone very close to Julius suddenly died in what appeared to be a tragic accident. A 36-year-old woman named Minnie Sweetman and her husband Paul had become very close friends with Julius and Joanne. The couples would hang out all the time and they became really close, and this friendship eventually led the Sweetmans to become very loyal followers of Julius's religious teachings. Now, Julius at this point had started encouraging his small group of followers to swap spouses. And so over time, Paul and Julius decided that they should swap wives. So now Minnie was with Julius and Paul was with Joanne. Joanne even eventually changed her last name to Sweetman. And the relationship between Joanne and Paul seemed, at least at first, to be pretty solid, but the same could not be said for Minnie. She was now in a relationship with a man who believed he had a direct link to God, and this God complex was just getting worse and worse. And then things really came to a head when Minnie discovered that Julius was sexually abusing not only his own biological daughters, but also one of Minnie's daughters, a girl named Beverly Sweetman. And Minnie was attempting to get herself and her children away from Julius. She actually called her mother and told her that she really wanted to leave. But just 1 week after making that phone call to her mother, she died in a tragic accident. The details surrounding Minnie's death are a little hard to pin down. In one version of the story, Minnie was hanging curtains and she was standing on a chair when she suddenly fell and hit her head. In the other version, she was screwing in a light bulb when she fell. The circumstances are still a mystery to this day, but it is thought that Julius wanted Minnie dead because she had discovered the sexual abuse that was going on in the Schacknow home, and she also likely knew that Julius had started that fire and killed 7 of the Jaquish children. Minnie's daughter Beverly was the one who found her unconscious on the floor, and she called for help. Minnie was rushed to the hospital and put on life support, but she sadly did not make it. Her official cause of death was a brain hemorrhage, but Minnie's family did not believe that this was an accident. Julius was acting very bizarre after Minnie's death. At the viewing, he was caught by Minnie's family attempting to raise her from the dead. Can you even imagine that? You are at a viewing in a funeral home in mourning when some weirdo goes up to the casket and starts trying to raise your loved one from the dead. Minnie's family was totally disgusted and weirded out by Julius, and there ended up being like a full-on yelling match right there in the funeral home, and Minnie's family kicked Julius out. But before he left, he told them that within a year, he would bring Minnie back from the dead. Needless to say, that did not happen. So because of all of this, Minnie's relatives were very suspicious of Julius. They really thought that he might have something to do with her death. So they hired a private investigator and they begged the police to reopen the case, but they refused. So once again, Julius very well could have gotten away with murder. Not long after Minnie's death, Julius decided to uproot everyone, including his followers, and move to Connecticut. He would later say that God told him to leave New Jersey and go to Connecticut, but it's thought that he was trying to basically distance himself from the whole mini situation. So he and Joanne and Paul, all of their children, and all of the followers that Julius had acquired ended up moving to a town called Thomaston in Connecticut, and then they later settled in Meriden. And I can't imagine what the locals were thinking watching this strange cult move into their little town. So right before the move to Connecticut, Julius claimed that he had another vision. He said that God appeared and told him that he was in fact his son, Jesus Christ, and he also gave him powers. And after this second vision, Julius would refer to himself as the sinful Messiah. And so by the time that they moved to Connecticut, Julius was telling people that he was Jesus and that Paul Sweetman was now his chief apostle. And Paul basically became Julius's second in command. Julius had 11 other apostles, and they would each be assigned to a specific astrological sign, and they would be in charge of all of the cult members whose birthdays fell under that specific sign. And the apostles were supposed to keep their assigned members in line. Joanne was now known as the Holy Spirit, and Joanne was a piece of work herself. She was not an innocent bystander in this, which you will definitely see later in the case. Around this time, Julius became a healer, and he would put his hands on people and they would start shaking as if he was actually healing them. There was actually one woman who was introduced to Brother Julius and the Work cult by her son. Her son had recently become a member, and he wanted to bring his family into the fold. So his mom agreed to come to a meeting, and she later claimed that Julius healed her psoriasis. She had pretty severe psoriasis. After that first meeting, she claimed that he had healed it, and she was hooked. After that first meeting, she became a lifelong believer. Even after her son later left the cult because of all the really shady, messed up stuff that was going on, she decided to stay, and she broke all communication with him. And Julius would use these powers to not only heal people and help people, but he would also use them to punish people. He would threaten to strike down the non-believers. He would threaten to make them go blind. And this is jumping ahead a bit, but I feel like it's appropriate to mention this now. When the space shuttle, the Challenger, exploded in 1986, Julius told his followers that he was the one responsible for the explosion because he didn't want the centers of Earth having any influence over his followers on Jupiter. This is where all the science fiction stuff comes in. But the most prevalent thing that Julius preached about was the coming apocalypse. When you really get down to it, this was a doomsday cult.
I'm here to close the world in fiery judgments. I'm here to punish men for sinning against me. I'm here to end the whole Christian church. I'm here to restore my people Israel to my favor. I'm here to raise dead people in different places so that people's crimes will be found out.
Julius would make all of these predictions about when the world was going to end, and then he would say that it was going to be his job to walk the earth and destroy every evil person, and he would be able to do this by just pointing his finger at them. He would point at them and they're just going to drop dead. And he would use this as a way to keep his followers in line. So people were terrified to leave or to question anything. And if anyone ever did question him, he would say that he was just a mirror of their true self. So if they were accusing Julius of being like selfish or dishonest, he would say that it actually meant that they were selfish and dishonest. Paul, in addition to being the chief apostle, was put in charge of all of the business dealings involved in the cult. And this cult at one point was making millions and millions of dollars. So the cult started a company called the Anointed Music and Publishing Company, and they funded a cult band. So the band was formed in order to reach more young people and bring them into the cult. I believe the name of the band was called Anointed, and some of the songs were pretty well known at the time, and most people had no clue that they were actually listening to cult propaganda. But what brought big money into the cult was their real estate and construction businesses. They had their hands in the real estate market big time. As a matter of fact, Century 21, a very well-known real estate company, was at one point affiliated with Joanne and Paul Sweetman. They had their own division called J&N North, and there were like 5 different Century 21 J&N North companies that that were operating at one point. The cult members would be forced to work in these various businesses, and they would put in up to 80-hour work weeks. And then every week they would all line up to get their pay, which one member said was never more than $200 a week, sometimes much less. Another member said that they never received more than $60 per week. So most of the cult members were living in poverty. They would end up having to use credit cards just to buy food for their families, and most of them ended up going on government assistance or unemployment. And while everyone else was struggling so hard to make ends meet, Paul and Joanne were just living their best lives, spending millions of dollars. In addition to the real estate businesses that they had, they also had a home construction business. So between the real estate business and the home construction business, the cult was pulling in millions of dollars a year. And Paul and Joanne were spending a lot of this money on themselves. Their kids went to expensive private schools. They all drove nice cars. They had big houses. Joanne even bought herself a private plane. So they were just living it up while the lower level members were going without basic needs most of the time. Eventually, Julius did have another vision, and this time he claimed that he was in fact God. He had reached his final form.
It's nothing for me to control the universe while I'm sitting here. If I'm the Lord God, how do you think I must feel as God, watching all the murders, the rapes, the fornication, the hates, the deceit, the clandestine things that are going on? I have a time. I came back into my own eternal knowledge years ago, but I have a time. Because I'm on earth, I've accelerated all the judgments.
And by the time he declared himself to be God, he was controlling pretty much every aspect of the cult members' lives. He would arrange marriages between the members. Even if the people just did not want to get married, he would force them into it. There were people who would approach Julius about someone that they were interested in, and he would just put a stop to it if he didn't want those two people to be together. The younger members were encouraged to drop out of school and not attend college. If anyone got out of line, they would be publicly embarrassed and berated in front of all of the other members. No one was allowed to wear black clothing. In fact, everyone, including the children, were required to wear white robes. They also all had to wear a necklace that had the Star of David with a cross through it. If you were sick, you just needed to pray. You couldn't go to the hospital. You didn't go to the doctor. You just prayed, because Julius said only faith could heal you. And he would also say that you were only sick because of something bad you had done. So if you had a headache, it was because you were having impure thoughts. If you had heart problems, he would say it was because you were hardening your heart towards him. And just to further strip the members of their identities, to make them even more vulnerable, Julius would give them all new names. But they weren't really names. They were actually just words describing the person. For example, one former member said that her name became Abundance Affection. So like first name Abundance, last name Affection. But over time, that name grew into Divinely Abundant Affectioningness of God. Her actual name was Lisa, by the way. And Lisa has spoken out in detail about her experience in the cult, and it was horrible. So her family had joined the cult when she was about 9 years old. Lisa's mother was very much into the cult. She had heard Julius preach just once, and that was it. She was hooked. She then convinced her husband to uproot their family from Boston, Massachusetts, and then move to Connecticut to be close to Julius. But Lisa's father was not a believer in anything that Julius said. He did not trust Julius. He didn't believe all of the outlandish things that he was preaching, but he also didn't want his family to break up. So he was pretty much just staying because he wanted to keep his family together. Then one night, Lisa's dad came home from work and he looked terrible. He was obviously in distress and he was having chest pains. So Lisa goes and gets her mother to help because she's pretty sure that her father's having a heart attack. But the cult members were told not to go to the hospital, remember? They were just supposed to pray. So that's what her mother did. She prayed over him for hours while Lisa was just begging her to take him to the hospital. She finally did give in and she took him to the hospital, but it was too late. She had waited too long to take him in, and he sadly died soon after arriving at the hospital. And just to add to the pain that Lisa was feeling over the death of her father, Julia started telling everyone in the cult that her dad had died because he didn't believe in him, and now he's currently burning in hell. So Lisa is now being forced to sit and listen to him him say all of these awful things about her dead father. And things would sadly only get worse for Lisa. Julius collected what he called his concubines, which were just young girls in the cult that he would handpick to have sex with. And when Lisa was just 15 years old, she was approached by Julius after a long day of listening to him preach, which, by the way, he would preach for 12 hours sometimes. That's insane. So Julius approached Lisa after this marathon preaching session, and he asked her if she, quote, felt the Spirit of God yet. And then he asked her if she wanted to feel the Spirit where it really counts. And this was Julius's pattern. This was not specific to Lisa. He did this to countless other girls in the cult. And this is how he would approach them. He would ask them a question like, how would you like to get to know God better? Or things like that. A question that he thought that they would have to say yes to. And then the abuse would start.
He approached me at one point and said, how would you like God to show you how much he loves you? Of course, I'd love God to show me how much he loves me.
So when Lisa was approached, she was in a panic because she knew what he was asking her to do. So she went home and told her mom about it. And her mom was happy. She was proud. This was an honor to be chosen by God. Lisa did eventually manage to escape the cult. She ended up getting married to another member, and they had a daughter together. And once she had a child, especially the fact that she had a daughter, knowing that she would probably become a victim of Julius's one day, she knew she had to leave. So one day she packed up all of her stuff, she grabbed her little girl, and they got the hell out of there, leaving behind her mother, her brother, and her husband, but she never looked back. Julius would also test the men in the cult by telling them that he had to have sex with their wives in order to bring them closer to God, meaning himself. So his followers, including his closest members, his apostles, would have to turn their wives over to Julius, which is just so sick. One former member said that right after he and his wife got married, she was forced to go to Julius, and he kept her for a very long time, like days. And when Julius finally released her and she was sent back to her husband, she was covered in blisters and bruises all over her body. And this woman was only 19 years old at the time. Julius would also instruct the women in the cult to only think about him when they were having sex with their husbands. And Julius was not the only man in the cult abusing the women and young girls. There were several other higher-ups within the cult that were doing the same thing. A few former members have said that Julius would encourage them to have vasectomies so that the women would only get pregnant by himself or the higher-ups in the cult. And all of this sexual abuse and coercion had a name. Julius called it his special work. And Joanne had her own special work. She would proposition the men in the group, and most of the men felt obligated to just go along with it. So Joanne was also abusing her position in the cult. Over the years, Julius had collected 7 wives, and his own daughter has claimed that she was abused for years by her father, and that he had even told her that he wanted her to become one of his wives one day.
He told me he had purposes for me, and I needed to fulfill those. And he wanted to explain to me that I was the only one of his children that did not fulfill his purposes, and he needed to envelop me, was what he said, with his love as God the Father, and help me to understand his special work.
Now, he wanted you to become one of his wives.
Yeah.
Several of the women who suffered this abuse would fall into deep depressions, and some of them ended up taking their own lives. And when word would get back to Julius about their deaths, he would blame it on them leaving the cult. He would tell everyone that they had died because they went down an evil path. And in addition to the psychological and sexual abuse, Julius would also physically abuse the members. He would occasionally force entire families to come up in front of everyone during his sermons, and he would make them pull down their pants and their underwear, and then he would beat them with a leather belt.
I saw 3 families be publicly spanked with their pants and underwear down in front of the whole group at Sunday meetings, to make a point that God was displeased with their parenting skills. And one of the women was about 8 months pregnant. That was a very humiliating experience. And practically everybody in the group's heads were hanging because they were mortified that these families had to take their pants down in front of everyone and be spanked by Julius.
These were entire families, so the parents and the children were all being beaten by this man. I don't know anyone in their right minds who would let their spouse and their children be physically abused and publicly humiliated like that. So this just shows you how brainwashed the members were. They were totally convinced that Julius really was God and that they were being punished. And all of the abuse was kept quiet, even by people who finally left the cult. They just wanted to put everything behind them. But in 1986, Beverly Sweetman, the daughter of Minnie and Paul, was now in her 30s. She had left the cult by this point, and she filed a civil suit against Julius for the sexual abuse that she had suffered when she was only 15 years old. And then just 2 years after that civil suit was filed, another woman came forward. This time it was one of Julius's own biological children. She had just left the cult the year before, and she accused Julius of abusing her starting at the age of only 11 years old. She said that the abuse went on for years and that Julius would even force her to watch as he did the same things to her siblings. And all of these allegations started putting Julius and the work cult into the media spotlight. So now not only were people learning about the existence of this cult that was operating in the suburbs of Connecticut, but they were also hearing about all of the sexual abuse that was happening behind closed doors. Unfortunately, no criminal charges could be filed because the statute of limitations were up, but major damage had been done to the cult and the numbers were dwindling like crazy. Century 21 also distanced themselves from the real estate business that the cult was leading. So even though no criminal charges could be filed, at least there was some damage done to the cult. And after this, the numbers dwindled down to about 100 members. At their peak, they only had about 500 to 300 members, but this was still a pretty big loss. And Julius never denied these allegations against him, even when he had the chance to do so in interviews. He would just become really defensive and angry when he was ever asked about his special work.
Some of those people who have walked away from you have said that they have done so because they became extremely distressed about what you call your special work.
You didn't agree to that. We end the meeting right now. You wouldn't understand that, Alan.
Is there anything you could tell the people who are watching this about these allegations that have come over years and years and years?
You will give an account like everybody else for every move.
And then in 1996, Julius died from natural causes at the age of 71. It's believed that he had a heart attack. And this is where the video should end, but unfortunately the story isn't over. We still have one more death to discuss, and this one, unlike the others, has been confirmed to be a murder linked to the cult. So when Julius died in 1996, Paul Sweetman, his chief apostle, took over the cult, with his wife Joanne acting as second in command. Not long after he took over, Paul ended up running into a lot of legal problems. It had been discovered that he had been taking out fraudulent loans from several different banks, and he had also been stealing out of the cult business pension accounts. Over the years, Paul had stolen over $3 million. And it sounds like Joanne was involved in this too, or at least knew about it, but as far as I could tell, there were no charges brought against her. In 1999, Paul pleaded guilty to the charges against him, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. And while he was in prison, Joanne acted as leader of the cult. And I think Joanne always wanted to take over. She definitely seemed like someone who was power hungry. So when Paul was released from prison in 2003, there was a bit of a power struggle between himself and Joanne, not just over the cult, but also over control of the remaining businesses. And then in 2004, not long after his release from prison, Paul just disappeared without a trace. Joanne called the police a few days after he disappeared to report him missing, but other than finding his car, there were no leads. And remember the leg that we talked about way earlier, the leg that the coyote dug up and it was found on the golf course? Well, that leg was discovered just 4 weeks after Paul disappeared. But because the leg was found in a different area of Connecticut, like a different jurisdiction from the one that Joanne had reported Paul missing from, the police didn't connect Paul's missing person case to the severed leg. So both Paul's case and the case of the mysterious leg went cold. That was until 2000. 2016. In 2016, a former cult member named Rudy Hannon was serving an unrelated prison sentence when he suddenly just decided to start talking. And he had some very interesting information about the Paul Sweetman case. He said that Paul Sweetman wasn't just missing, he had been murdered back in 2004, and his body parts had been scattered all across the state. Police are just in shock because they had never connected the Paul Sweetman case to the leg. And once they took a closer look at Rudy Hannon, they realized that he had been a member of the Work cult and a devoted follower of Julius. And once word got out about Rudy Hannon's claims, the police finally connected Paul to the missing leg. They tracked down Paul's son and obtained a DNA sample, and they were able to confirm that the leg did in fact belong to Paul Sweetman. But how did this happen? Well, police learned that Rudy Hannon, along with another cult member, a man named Sorik Minery, had murdered Paul back in 2004. Sorik Minery had a construction business, and on the business property he had a shop, and it was discovered that Paul was beaten almost to death in that shop. Then his body was put into a freezer, and it is thought that Paul was still alive when he was placed inside that freezer. Then 4 days later, Minery returned to the shop, took Paul's body out of the freezer, and dismembered it using a power saw. The body parts were then scattered in various areas. The torso and arms were later found under Minery's shed in some concrete, and the head and legs had been buried in a wooded area, and then the coyote dug up one of the legs and it ended up on the golf course.
A second New Britain cold case suspect under arrest. Police say 42-year-old Sorik Minery from Burlington killed Paul Sweetman back in July of 2004. Minery being held on $5 million bond. Another man, 72-year-old Rudy Hannon, also facing charges in connection with Sweetman's murder.
Sorik Minery was arrested, and he and Rudy were both questioned separately, and the men were basically just blaming each other for the murder. Rudy said that he had just delivered Paul to Minery's shop, and Minery had killed him. Minery said that he arrived at his shop and found Rudy standing over Paul's dead body, and he had only agreed to disposing of the body. But the thing that they both agreed on was that Paul had been killed because they believed that he was mistreating and hurting Joanne. Minery said in the months leading up to the murder, he was repeatedly told about the alleged terrible things that Paul was doing to Joanne, and at the time he believed it. He said that Rudy had convinced him that the right thing to do was to kill Paul in order to protect Joanne. And remember, Joanne was seen as a very high up person within the cult. She was considered to be the Holy Spirit. So if the cult members thought that someone was hurting her, it's not hard to believe that they would have gone to extreme measures to protect her. But the more widely believed version is that Joanne herself had set up this murder. She had orchestrated the entire thing in order to get Paul out of the picture so she could take over the cult and all of the businesses. But unfortunately, Joanne died before police could question her about everything. In fact, she died in 2011 before the leg was ever even linked to Paul Sweetman. And I don't know how Joanne died, but I'm assuming just from natural causes. Rudy Hannon pleaded not guilty to murder charges, but he died in prison in 2022 of a COVID-related complication while awaiting trial. Sorik Minery pleaded no contest to the murder charges, and he took a plea deal. For some reason, I had a hard time finding Sorik Minery's sentence, but I read in one source that he was sentenced to only 9 years in prison. And what makes this even crazier is that this cult still exists today. There aren't very many members. There are less than 100 members in the cult, but they are still actively trying to recruit new followers. They apparently have this really annoying habit of infiltrating other churches, and during the sermons they'll just stand up and tell everyone that they're being led by false shepherds and that they need to save themselves by committing to the one and only Lord Julius Christ. Then they are promptly escorted out of the church and asked to never return. And that was the case of Julius Schacknow and the Work cult. Let me know what you guys think about this one. Let me know if you've ever heard of this one. Do you guys think that Julius was responsible for the death of the Jaquish kids or Minnie Sweetman? He was so unhinged, and he obviously felt like he was untouchable, so I think it's very likely that he was involved. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And don't forget about the MyHeritage giveaway. Just leave a comment telling us why you want a DNA kit and you will be entered into the giveaway. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing. We're getting so close to 100,000 subscribers, so please subscribe if you're interested in this type of content. I also cover true crime and historical cases, so yeah, subscribe if you like that kind of stuff. And you can also follow me on Instagram at Summer_SanchezYT. As always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.